Do you have a least favorite word or phrase or something that just sets you off? Well, I actually have a couple, but one of my least favorite is yeah, but, or a variation of that is like, I totally agree, but. So when it comes to our definition of inclusion, people love to say they love it, but. So let's get a few things straight. First of all, when we talk about inclusive education, we are not talking about placements. Now, this is very confusing for people because the biggest yeah, but we get is yeah, but there's a kid who has so much anxiety that the general education classroom isn't safe for them or doesn't feel comfortable. And so aren't you doing more harm by requiring that everybody be in an inclusive education classroom? Or we'll hear, yeah, I totally believe in inclusion, but I don't think that kids that need counseling should all be in the same classroom. Shouldn't they have privacy and confidentiality? Or we'll hear, hey, what about small groups? Now we're making everybody have a one size fits all just because you're requiring that everybody have inclusive education. All right, see, I could go on forever, right? So let's back it up a lot. First of all, as I mentioned, inclusive education is not about placement, but let's just talk about placement for a minute because there's several myths around the placement decisions that teams make around students with disabilities. So first of all, our definition of inclusive education is about our mindset, our heart set, and our skill set. So our mindset is what do we believe about disability? Our heart set is how do we approach supporting a range of learners? And our skill set is what do we actually do to take those beliefs and those feelings and put them into action. So it's a formula in terms of 9 essential ingredients. It's inspirational in terms of including in the sense of wanting a sense of belonging and to dismantle ableist practices and on and on. So when we're talking about inclusive education, we're not talking about the general education in a classroom, but we are at the same time. So let's keep breaking it down. So first of all, we need to have a continuum of services and supports. Some people think we need to have a continuum of placements, and that gets us into a whole lot of trouble. So just change your little verbiage there and talk about a continuum of services and supports. But then when we talk about services and supports, we have to see that support is a verb, not a person. It's also not a place. So when you think about supports, we think about them being portable. Services and supports can be brought to the student where they are. Well, where might a student be? Well, in the general education classroom. But that starts getting us back to phrases that I also don't like push in or pull aside. So let's keep talking about what does it mean to have a continuum of supports and services? What does it mean to be inclusive? And what does it not mean in terms of placement? So in the United States, we follow the federal law for disabilities, which is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. And it has not been reauthorized since 2004, but it has continued to evolve over several reauthorizations. So if you use current law, which doesn't feel all that current, I know, it does not say anything about placements other than some conversations about placements as a decision that the IEP team makes. So all of a sudden you go, oh, we can't require something for all students with disabilities because that would be missing an opportunity to individualize. And you'd be spot on, right? Because placement decisions aren't made by policies. They are not made by assistant superintendents. They are not made by Julie and Christy at Inclusive Schooling. They are made by IEP teams, and those decisions are made at the very end of an IEP team process. After we've talked about present levels, we've talked about IEP-worthy needs, we've identified if goals need to be written, we've aligned services and supports, not placements, on a continuum to meet those needs, and then we talk about placement. And then the placement is driven by the least restrictive environment clause of IDEA. So we always default to the least restrictive environment until we can show evidence that we cannot meet that student's individual needs as identified by the IEP team through that process in a less restrictive way. And oftentimes when it's more restrictive, it's temporary, it's unique, it's it's done with much intentionality, not how we currently do things by saying something like, oh, we have a multi-disabilities classroom that serves second and third graders. Your child has a diagnosis of multiple disabilities or a label in our state for multiple disabilities. So here's their classroom. That would not be a correct way, or rather even a legal way, or even a successful way of meeting the needs of that student with disabilities. So back to our definition of inclusive education. We're setting the tone for the mindset, the heart set, and the skill set to do inclusive education well. So then you go back to IDEA and say, all right, what does IDEA say about this notion of the general education environment? Or classroom? Well, basically it's saying the least restrictive environment would be anywhere a student that's in second grade or third grade or in high school or preschool, where would they be if they didn't have a disability? Well, most second graders in the United States during the academic or school year would be in the general education classroom. Also recess, also in the lunchroom, also at, specials, also in the hallway, also on the bus, right? So it says broadly, any school experience, and it uses the phrase curricular and non-curricular. Some people will say intended and unintended curriculum, but IDEA says we don't mean a place. We do not mean that a student with a disability must receive support and services in the least restrictive environment, and that is not synonymous with the general education classroom. It's saying the student with disabilities must receive services and supports, and through subsequent case law, those services and supports have been deemed to be portable, should be delivered in a way that meets the student's IEP needs that were agreed upon by the IEP team in the least restrictive environment, ensuring three things: that the student with a disability has access, participation, and can make progress. So then again, you go access to what, participation in what, and progress towards what. So again, IDEA says the general education curriculum. Doesn't say the general education classroom. So what is the general education curriculum? And oftentimes researchers, thought leaders, Julie and I will say general education, content, curriculum, and peers, because we're trying to embrace the curricular and non-curricular or intended and unintended curriculum of what students learn by being at school. So we often say access to, participation in, and progress towards general education content, curriculum, and peers. Not all of those make complete grammatically great sentences, but you get the idea. So you have three things that you're thinking about: access to the general curriculum, access to the general content, and access to general education peers. Then you do that same thing with participation and that same thing with progress. So let's take content. Content would be easily thought of our standards. In this age of accountability, it would be that sort of notion. However, we have things that we learn as humans that aren't in the standards, that are often things that come in the form of how to develop morals, how to move about in a community, how to regulate our emotions, not always spelled out or identified in public schools in the United States, because we have ELA teachers and math teachers and science and social studies, or in early childhood, we have communication and adaptive and fine motor and gross motor. But who's really thinking about, all these notions of morals and ethics and regulation and all the wholeness of the student, which comes back to our definition of inclusive education, which says these are whole people who do not need to be fixed. So we're saying, all right, you are a whole being in this community where you want to belong. What do we need to support, and what services do we need to provide to ensure your access, participation, and progress in the general education content, which we're broadly defining as the standards, and then everything else that a human needs to participate fully in that school community, and many would argue within the larger community of their family, their city, their town, their country, their nation, and so forth. Then you can start to break that down to even more things. Then you can go, what is the curriculum? Well, certainly it could be the adopted curriculum that we're using for reading or social emotional or math. It can also be, again, back to that idea of curricular and extracurricular content and curriculum. And then again, that unintended curriculum, sort of like when a kid learns bad habits or learns swear words. You're like, that's not what we intended to teach, but they picked it up really easily. That was the unintended curriculum. So we have to account for that as well, because we are humans in this ecosystem. And then progress. Progress is not about progress towards IEP goals in this first layer of conversation. Progress is about progressing in the general education content and curriculum. So when we think about progress, we want to say, what would help this student have access and participate, but also flourish, also make progress in a way that promotes their independence and interdependence. It does not mean we are closing the gap. That's upholding white supremacy and this notion that there is a gap that needs to be closed, which is counter to our definition of inclusive education. It's also a construct that we create in schools that actually farther marginalized students. So we want to think about them as a whole person. How do they make progress for the goals that they have on their IEP? Sort of, but really, are we ensuring that they have increased access, increased participation, increased progress towards the standards, towards the unintended curriculum, towards a sense of belonging? All things that aren't super easy to measure, I understand. So we're thinking about all along this way, not saying that our definition of inclusive education or the broader research on inclusive education means we put every child, regardless, into a general education classroom and then say, good luck, hope it goes well. No. We always think about the individualized student. We make placement decisions separate from this broader context of what we're trying to achieve with inclusive education. That decision is made by the IEP team, and we're writing IEPs that are geared towards, focused on ensuring access, participation, and progress in the general education content, curriculum, and general education peers. Then the ultimate placement decision almost should fall into our lap and say, well, duh, of course the second grader should spend the majority of their time with second graders doing second grade things, and often in the second grade classroom with portable services and supports that are simultaneously ensuring access, participation, and progress. So you see, a single Instagram post or a single handout or a single 90-minute session with Julie and me can't explain all of that. And there's even more, because what are the services and supports? What do you mean they're verbs and not people and places? And how do we get people trained to do this? And how do we ensure that it's fair and equitable? And how do we ensure that everyone's needs are met, all the way back to the kid who needs counseling, to the kid who needs toileting and privacy, to the kid who has anxiety, to the kid who. Absolutely yes to all of that. And that's why this is a journey that we're on. But the idea that we begin with is that our mindset, our heart set, and our skill sets are moving in this direction to bring us into compliance with IDEA, to bring us into ethical compliance, that all humans have this right to access, participate, and make progress. And we're not saying somebody's rights are more than someone else's. It might mean that a student who is in a classroom for any reason other than their second grader may be disruptive, may struggle, may do something that feels negative to another student or to a family or to a teacher. And yes, we have to work all of that out, because in public education, we are bound to serve any and all students. We don't ship them to other places. We don't put them in other buildings. We don't pull them out over a side. We don't create separate spaces to address their disability label. We look at the individuals within the context of the overarching goal, which is to ensure inclusive education in the least restrictive environment, which hopefully now you have a sense is much more than just placement.